I didn't scream. I didn't run. I didn't even drop my keys. I just froze, with dried clay under my fingernails, and that stupid little receipt from the studio crumpled in my fist. Because across the parking lot, under a broken streetlight that flickered like it was nervous, my husband was leaning against my car like it belonged to him, like I belonged to him. He smiled and said, "Hey." I was nearby. And the sick part is, I almost believed him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Hi. My name is Megan, I'm 29, and for a long time I thought my marriage was normal. Not perfect, not Disney, just normal. And if you've ever had that slow, quiet feeling that something's off, without being able to prove it, then you're going to understand exactly how I disappeared. Before we go any further, if this kind of story hits a nerve in you, follow this channel. Not because I'm special, but because you're not the only one who's ever thought, am I losing my mind, or am I finally seeing clearly? Okay, let me take you back to the version of me who still believed nearby meant coincidence. Ethan was the kind of husband people complimented in front of you, the kind they pointed at like a rare collectible. He's so calm. He's so supportive. You're lucky. He's not like those guys who disappear on you. He held doors. He remembered birthdays. He'd smile at my friends' boyfriends and shake their hands like he was running for office. And I know how this sounds already, like I'm about to twist an innocent man into a monster. But here's the thing. He didn't start as a monster. He started as pleasant, like beige walls, like soft music in a dentist office, nothing you'd ever warn your friends about. We met in Charlotte, one of those breweries where the lighting is warm and everybody pretends it's not loud. I was there with co-workers, still in that phase of my life where I wanted to be perceived as easygoing, even when I was exhausted. Ethan wasn't flashy, no big talk, no overconfidence. He asked questions and actually waited for the answer. That was the first thing that hooked me, because I'd dated guys who asked questions just to set up their next story. Ethan asked like he was collecting facts. At the time, I thought that meant interest. Now, I'm not sure it did. Our relationship was simple in a way that felt adult. No chaos, no dramatic fights, no jealousy scenes. He never told me what to wear. Never told me who I could talk to. And because I had friends who were in real, obvious messes, men who yelled, cheated, punched holes in walls, Ethan looked like a green flag waving in the wind. I remember saying to my best friend Tasha, "I think I finally found someone stable." And she laughed like, finally. We moved in together after a year. A little townhouse with a narrow staircase and a kitchen that always smelled like someone else's dinner because the neighbor fried everything. We got married in a small venue outside Asheville. I wore my grandmother's earrings. Ethan cried, but politely, quietly. People said it was romantic. I said it was perfect. And for a while, it was easy. But ease can be a trap. Because when something starts going wrong slowly, you don't notice it. You adapt. You shrink. You call it maturity. The first thing I lost wasn't my friends. It wasn't my confidence. It wasn't even my voice. It was privacy. Not the dramatic kind, not passwords, not cameras, not phone checks. Just the feeling that I could have a thought, a moment, a part of myself that wasn't immediately mirrored back to me. At first, it felt sweet. I'd mention, I might stop at Target after work, and he'd text 5 minutes later, "Grab oat milk if you see it." Okay, cute. I'd say, "I'm thinking about taking a yoga class," and he'd send me 3 studio options and say, "I looked at reviews. This one seems safest." Safest. I remember the word because it made me pause. Yoga isn't skydiving, but I ignored that pause, because ignoring small discomfort is basically a female hobby. Then it got slightly weirder. I'd run into him. Not like at home. Not like planned. I mean, in the world. I'd stop at a coffee shop on my lunch break, and he'd walk in randomly 10 minutes later. He'd smile like it was fate and say, "Look at that. I was nearby." The first time I laughed. The second time I joked, "Do you have a tracker on me?" He laughed too. This soft little exhale and kissed my forehead. Don't be dramatic. Beat. The third time I didn't joke. I just watched him. Watched the way he looked around the room before he looked at me. Like he was checking something. Like he was confirming. Here's what you have to understand about Ethan. He never did anything loud. He did things that sounded reasonable. If you told someone, "My husband keeps showing up places," they'd say, "Aw, he misses you." Or worse, "At least he cares." And I believed that for a long time, because I'm not someone who wanted to be the woman who complains about a good husband. I didn't want to be ungrateful, so I kept reshaping it into something cute, something safe, something that meant I was loved. And maybe, at first, that's what it was. But love and control can wear the same outfit. It just depends on who's holding the zipper. The pottery class came later, and it wasn't some eat, pray, love moment. It was survival. I was working from home by then, remote marketing job, endless Slack messages, meetings that could have been an email, the kind of work where your brain never stops buzzing. And I realized weeks could pass where the only physical thing I touched was my laptop. So when I saw a flyer at a little coffee shop, beginner pottery Thursday nights, I signed up without thinking too hard. It was on the other side of town, out near a warehouse district that was half art studios, half places you wouldn't walk alone at night unless you had pepper spray and good instincts. The studio smelled like wet earth and eucalyptus. There were shelves of half-dried bowls and mugs and these lopsided little sculptures that made me feel less alone. The instructor was a woman named Pam, who wore paint-stained overalls and spoke like she'd seen every kind of heartbreak and decided not to carry it. There was music playing, old soul stuff, and for the first time in a long time, my shoulders dropped. Because in that room, no one needed anything from me. No performance, no pleasing, no explaining. Just hands in clay, just focus. Just me. When I told Ethan about the class, he smiled. That perfect, supportive husband smile. "That's great," he said. "I'm happy you're doing something for yourself." Then he asked, casually, like he was asking what I wanted for dinner, "What's the address?" I blinked. "Why?" "So, if something happens, I know where you are. Reasonable. Safety." I gave it to him. And the next Thursday, I went. I parked under a buzzing light. I walked in and washed my hands and sat at the wheel. And for 2 hours, I forgot I was somebody's wife. I forgot the mental load, forgot the constant "we," forgot the invisible leash of being known too well. Then class ended, and I walked outside with my little paper bag, my first ugly mug inside it, like a proud failure. My phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. "How was it?" I smiled. Sweet. I typed back, "Messy, fun, I made something ugly." Then I looked up and saw him, across the parking lot, leaning against my car, not waving, not walking toward me, just waiting. Like he'd always been there. Beat. And he smiled, like he'd done nothing wrong. "Hey," he said. I was nearby. I want to be honest about my first reaction. It wasn't fear, it was confusion. Because what do you do with a moment that looks innocent, but feels wrong? I remember standing there, trying to calculate the math in my head. Ethan worked in Uptown. This was 30 minutes away, on a weeknight. At 9:15 p.m., there was nothing nearby about it. And still, my mouth opened and I said the same thing women always say when their instincts whisper something inconvenient. "Oh, funny." He kissed my cheek. Too gentle, too practiced. "I thought I'd surprise you," he said. A surprise. That word. A normal woman might have loved that, might have posted it on Instagram with a heart emoji. But something in me tightened, because I didn't feel surprised. I felt caught. As if he'd walked in on me doing something I wasn't allowed to enjoy without him. And the worst part was, I didn't even know why. I didn't have proof. I didn't have a rule he'd broken. Just that feeling. That small, ugly, stubborn feeling that said, this isn't romantic. This is supervision. That night, on the drive home, he talked about my mug like it was a cute little project he'd sponsored. "You should make a set," he said. "We could have matching ones. You could sell them. We. And I stared out the window and watched streetlights smear into lines. Because the truth I wasn't ready to say yet was this. I hadn't joined pottery to create. I'd joined pottery to breathe. And now he was nearby there too. And I didn't know how to explain, without sounding crazy, that the way he showed up didn't feel like love. It felt like a hand closing around the back of my neck. Softly, politely, like no one else would notice. The pattern. I didn't say anything that night. That's important, because if you confront something too early, you look paranoid. And I didn't want to be paranoid. I wanted to be sane. So I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he had a client nearby. Maybe he'd been out for a drive. Maybe he really had wanted to surprise me. And here's the part that's hard to admit. I didn't want it to be something else. Because if it was something else, then that meant I had to look at my marriage differently. And I wasn't ready to do that. Over the next few weeks, nothing dramatic happened. No scenes, no fights, no raised voices, just adjustments. He started asking slightly more specific questions. What time does class end exactly? Who's in it? Mostly women? The tone was casual, almost bored. I'd answer without thinking. Yeah, mostly women. There's this older guy who makes teapots, and a college kid who keeps messing up her bowls. He'd nod like he was filing it somewhere. And that's what it felt like I was being cataloged. The second time he showed up, it wasn't in the parking lot. It was inside. I was washing my hands at the long industrial sink in the studio when I felt someone behind me. You know how your body knows before your brain does? That shift in air, that presence. I looked up in the mirror. He was standing in the doorway, smiling again. That same neutral, careful smile. Hey, Pam said it was cool if I watched. I blinked. Pam hadn't mentioned anyone asking to watch, but she also wouldn't have thought it was weird. He looked like a husband. He looked harmless. I laughed lightly. Oh, okay. And then I went back to the wheel. But here's the thing. When someone watches you make pottery, you become aware of your hands, of how messy you look, of how focused you are, of whether you look foolish. My shoulders tightened. My movements changed. I stopped enjoying it. I started performing it. And every time I glanced up, he was watching like I was a documentary, not affectionate, not admiring, studying. That night at dinner, he said something strange. You didn't mention the tall guy. What tall guy? The one with the sleeve tattoo. He corrected your grip. I paused. Because he was right. A guy had corrected my grip. But I had not told Ethan that. I didn't think it mattered. He shrugged. You showed me a picture. I didn't. I would remember that. I remember weird things, like what I wore on our third date, like the name of his childhood dog. But he said it so calmly, so confidently. You showed me. When you were laughing about how messy your hands were. I searched my memory. There was a gap, not a real gap, just that fuzzy feeling when someone insists on a version of events you can't confirm. Maybe, I said. And that was the moment something shifted inside me. Because maybe meant doubt. And doubt is fertile ground. I never caught him going through my phone. Never saw it unlocked in his hand. He never asked for passwords. But one morning, I noticed something small. My location sharing settings had been toggled. Not turned on. Not turned off. Just adjusted. Precision enabled. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to remember if I'd changed it. Maybe during an update. Maybe when an app prompted me. Maybe. There's that word again. Maybe. I didn't confront him, because I didn't know what I'd be accusing him of. And accusing a calm man of something you can't prove makes you look hysterical. And I refused to be hysterical. It was a Tuesday afternoon. No class that day. I left work early and decided, on a whim, to drive to a bookstore in a neighborhood I never went to. Didn't tell him, didn't post about it, didn't text anyone, just went. I spent an hour there, bought a novel and a journal, sat in the cafe and wrote for a while. And when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped before I even saw him. His car was parked across the street, engine off, windows up. I stood on the sidewalk for a full 10 seconds, telling myself it wasn't his, that lots of cars look alike. Then the driver door opened. He stepped out, slowly, as if he hadn't been sitting there for long. Oh, hey, he said casually. Didn't expect to see you here. Didn't expect. That sentence, that lie. Because he wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He wasn't asking what I was doing there. He was confirming. and I felt it in my chest. That small, quiet compression, like the world had just gotten a little tighter. I got in. Because what else was I going to do? Stand there and accuse him of what exactly? On the drive home, I kept my voice neutral. How did you end up here? He didn't hesitate. I had a feeling you'd be out. A feeling. I stared straight ahead. That's not really an answer. He exhaled through his nose. You're predictable when you're stressed. You drive. My hands tightened on my lap. That doesn't explain how you knew where. He turned slightly in his seat. I don't need GPS to know my wife. That line. It should have sounded romantic. It should have sounded like intimacy. Instead, it felt like surveillance disguised as affection. After that, something subtle began happening. I started announcing my movements. Not because he asked, but because not announcing them felt like rebellion. I'm going to Target. I'm meeting Tasha for lunch. I'll be home around 6. Preemptive alibis. Without realizing it, I was narrating my life. Because the alternative was being asked, calmly, later. Oh, you didn't mention that. And having to explain something that shouldn't need explaining. He never forbade anything. He just made spontaneity uncomfortable. And discomfort, over time, reshapes behavior. One night in bed, I asked lightly, do you ever feel like we're together? He rolled onto his side. What do you mean? I don't know. Like, maybe we don't need to know everything. He looked genuinely confused. Why wouldn't we? And that question, that innocent, reasonable question, was the most unsettling part. Because in his mind, closeness meant access. Access meant love. And love meant presence. Constant presence. He kissed my shoulder. I just like being around you. And I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, realizing I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt alone, even when I physically was. It didn't explode. It eroded, like water against stone. He'd appear. He'd comment. He'd remember things I hadn't told him. He'd imply patterns about me I didn't recognize. You get restless this time of year. You're more social when you feel guilty. You withdraw when you're hiding something. Hiding what? I wasn't hiding anything. But after a while, you start scanning yourself. Just in case. Just to make sure you aren't. And that's when it clicked. Not in a big, dramatic revelation. Just a quiet understanding. He didn't need a tracker. He had studied me. My roots. My moods. My breathing. He knew how long it took me to cool off after a meeting. He knew which cafe I chose when I wanted quiet. He knew how my shoulders moved when I was about to make an impulsive decision. He wasn't following my phone. He was following me. And that realization didn't make me feel loved. It made me feel mapped. The next time I decided to test him, I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not Tasha, not even myself, really. I just changed one small thing. And that's when everything stopped feeling like coincidence. The test. I didn't wake up that morning thinking, today I'm going to test my husband. That sounds manipulative. That sounds like the beginning of a toxic TikTok story. It wasn't that. It was quieter. It was the kind of decision you make when you're tired of not trusting your own instincts. I just wanted data. Not drama, not a fight. Just something I could point to and say, see, I'm not imagining this. That Thursday, I didn't go to pottery. I told him I was going. Same tone, same timing, same everything. I grabbed my tote bag, put on jeans I didn't mind getting dirty, left at the usual time. But instead of turning left toward the warehouse district, I turned right. I drove to a bookstore cafe in a different neighborhood. One I'd only been to once, months before. No social posts, no texts. Phone on silent in my bag. I ordered tea, sat in the back corner, and waited. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that nothing would happen, that I'd sit there for 2 hours, drink my tea, go home, and laugh at how paranoid I'd become. For 40 minutes, nothing happened. I almost felt relieved, almost embarrassed. Then my phone buzzed. A text. How's class? My stomach tightened. I stared at the message for a long time. The normal response would have been playful. Messy as usual. Instead, I typed, "Good." He replied instantly, "What are you making tonight?" Too specific. He'd never asked that before. I didn't answer. 3 minutes later, "You okay?" I swallowed. Because now it wasn't curiosity. It was checking. I finally responded, "Yeah. Why?" The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Just had a weird feeling. There it was again. Feeling. Always intuition, never explanation. An hour later, I decided to leave. I walked outside, heart pounding in a way that felt stupidly dramatic for someone just exiting a bookstore. And for a split second, I thought I'd been wrong. The parking lot was empty. No familiar car, no silhouette. I almost laughed. I got in my car, started the engine, pulled onto the street, and at the first red light, I saw him. In my rearview mirror, 2 cars back. He wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, wasn't doing anything illegal. He was just there. I told myself it wasn't him. Lots of gray SUVs in Charlotte. The light turned green. I switched lanes abruptly. The SUV switched too. My pulse started pounding in my ears. I turned into a residential street I had no reason to be on. He turned too, and that's when I knew. Not because I caught him doing something dramatic, but because I recognized the rhythm, the deliberate distance, close enough to follow, far enough to deny. I pulled over, hard, just stopped on the side of the street. The SUV slowed behind me, then pulled alongside. Driver window rolled down. It was him. Of course it was. He smiled. That same neutral smile. "What are you doing over here?" he asked lightly. I stared at him. "You tell me." He tilted his head. "I was heading home." "That's not the way home." He didn't miss a beat. "I thought you said class was off this week." I felt my chest hollow out. "I didn't." "Yes, you did." Calm, steady, certain. And here's the part that scared me the most. For half a second, I questioned myself. Did I mention something? Did I imply it? Did I post something vague? That hesitation was all he needed. He gave a small shrug. "Maybe I misunderstood." There it is. The exit ramp. Maybe. He didn't accuse. He didn't escalate. He just made space for doubt. And doubt always wins against instinct, at first. On the drive home, this time actually home, my hands were trembling. Not because he'd yelled, not because he'd threatened, but because I just experienced something that could be explained away. And that's worse. If he'd screamed, I could have labeled it. If he'd admitted it, I could have addressed it. But instead, I had this. A pattern of feelings, a series of coincidences, a husband who always had a gentle explanation, and me, sitting in the driver's seat of my own car, feeling like a suspect. That night at dinner, he brought it up again. "You've been distant lately." I almost laughed. "I've been distant?" He nodded slowly. "You've been secretive." Secretive. I blinked. "I went to a bookstore. You told me you had class." I changed my mind. He leaned back in his chair. "That's the thing." "What?" "You change your mind a lot." It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was clinical, like he was diagnosing a flaw. You get restless. You need stimulation. You get bored easily. He said it like data, and suddenly I felt small, predictable, flawed. Like maybe this wasn't about him showing up. Maybe it was about me being unstable. And that thought terrified me more than anything else. After that, my body changed. I became hyper-aware. If my phone buzzed, my stomach flipped. If I saw a gray SUV anywhere, my breath shortened. I started checking mirrors, started second-guessing routes, started narrating my plans again. Not because he demanded it, but because uncertainty is exhausting. And clarity, even fake clarity, is soothing. So I started oversharing. "I'm going to the grocery store. I'll be there about an hour. I'm meeting Tasha at 3. And every time I did, he relaxed. He'd kiss my forehead. Say, "Thank you for telling me." Thank you. Like I'd just fulfilled an obligation. I lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling fan, watching the blades rotate in slow circles, and it hit me. He didn't need technology. He didn't need trackers. He didn't need spyware. He had something far more precise. My fear of being unreasonable. As long as he stayed calm, As long as he never crossed a line that could be screenshot, as long as he framed everything as concern, I would always be the one questioning myself. And that's when the word surfaced in my mind. Not love, not control, not obsession, surveillance, emotional surveillance. He wasn't watching my location. He was watching my reaction, measuring it, adjusting to it, mapping it. I told myself I needed one more test. Something undeniable. Something that couldn't be explained by misunderstanding. And I didn't know it yet, but that test would lead to the moment I described at the beginning. The parking lot, the flickering light, the smile. I was nearby, and what I would eventually discover, 20 minutes into the story I didn't know I was living, was far worse than coincidence. The adjustment. After the bookstore incident, something changed in me. Not loudly, not dramatically, just structurally. Like a beam inside a house shifting slightly. The outside still looked fine. Inside, something had tilted. I stopped correcting him. That was the first change. If he misremembered something, I didn't argue. If he implied I'd told him something I hadn't, I let it sit. Because I realized something disturbing. Every time I defended myself, I looked defensive. Every time I insisted, I sounded unstable. So I went quiet, not submissive, observant. And when you stop reacting, people show more. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. No sightings, no weird comments. No, I had a feeling. He went back to normal, made dinner one night, watched TV beside me, put his arm around me in that absent-minded way that looked like affection. If someone had filmed us, it would have looked healthy. He even said one evening, "I'm glad you're doing your class. It seems good for you." I smiled, because I didn't know what to do with that. Was I wrong? Was I projecting? Was I exhausted and inventing patterns? Gaslighting doesn't always come from the other person. Sometimes it blooms inside you. Then came the smallest thing. And that's always how it works. Small things are harder to dismiss. I left class early one Thursday. No announcement, no text. Pam had to cancel the second half because her kiln malfunctioned. So I packed up, walked outside, and checked my phone. No messages. Good. I decided to drive home a different way again. Not because I was testing, just because I could. Halfway there, I noticed something strange. A car parked on a side street I never used. Engine running, lights off, facing the direction of the warehouse district. I wouldn't have thought anything of it. Except the driver's silhouette looked familiar. Too familiar. I drove past slowly, didn't look directly, just peripheral vision, gray SUV, same one. My throat went dry. He wasn't behind me this time. He wasn't coincidentally arriving. He was stationed, waiting. You know what's terrifying? It's not catching someone following you. It's realizing they might have been waiting. Every time. How many nights had he been there? How many times had I walked out feeling observed, but told myself I was being dramatic? And here's what makes it worse. He wasn't parked illegally. He wasn't trespassing. He wasn't doing anything I could call the police about. He was just in public, which meant I couldn't accuse him of anything concrete. And that's when I understood something about psychological control. If it leaves no evidence, it leaves you alone with your sanity. I didn't say anything when I got home. I waited. And he did exactly what I expected. Around 9:20 p.m., he walked into the kitchen where I was pouring water and said, "You get out early?" Not a question. A statement disguised as one. My skin prickled. Yeah, he leaned against the counter. I was thinking about stopping by. There it was again. Thinking. Almost. Not quite. "I didn't see you," I said calmly. He held eye contact, for just half a second too long. Must have missed me. And then he smiled. That same steady smile, like we were sharing a harmless joke. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid he'd hurt me, but because I was afraid I was right. And being right meant something much bigger than following. It meant intention. It meant planning. It meant he had chosen this pattern, over and over. I started replaying memories. Coffee shop, bookstore, studio doorway. Had he been waiting in his car more times than I'd realized? Had he been watching the parking lot, calculating when to step out? The thought made my stomach twist, because that's not spontaneous. That's rehearsal. The next morning, he did something subtle. He made pancakes. Not unusual, he's made breakfast before, but he set my plate down and said, "See, I'm not the villain in your imagination." I froze, because I hadn't accused him, not directly, but he knew. He could feel it, and instead of asking what was wrong, he preemptively dismissed it. Villain, imagination, 2 words designed to shrink me. I forced a smile. "I never said you were." He nodded. "I just don't want you building stories in your head. Stories, like the one I'm telling now." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet. I was in the shower a few nights later, steam filling the bathroom, water loud enough to blur outside noise, and suddenly I had this intrusive thought. What if he's standing outside the door, listening? Not because he suspects me of anything, but because he needs to know I'm still there, still contained, still predictable. I shut the water off, heart pounding, opened the bathroom door, no one there, just hallway light, silence. And yet, I didn't feel relieved. I felt aware, like prey that hasn't seen the predator yet, but knows it's somewhere nearby. Here's the truth I didn't want to admit. He didn't trust randomness. He didn't like unpredictability. He didn't like parts of my life that existed without him in the frame. And instead of forbidding them, he inserted himself. Strategically, quietly, plausibly. That's what made it brilliant. That's what made it terrifying. Because every time he appeared, he could say, "I just wanted to see you." And every time I felt uncomfortable, I looked unreasonable. Who complains about a husband who shows up? Who complains about a man who cares? The night of the parking lot, the flickering light, the smile. That wasn't the first time he'd been there. It was just the first time I understood something deeper. Something I wouldn't fully realize until later. Much later. When I'd finally connect the detail that changed everything. And when I did, I was nearby, stopped sounding like coincidence, and started sounding like a warning. The shrinking room. If it had stayed between us, maybe I would have survived it longer. Maybe I would have kept negotiating with myself. But control gets bolder when it realizes it's working. And the next shift didn't happen in a parking lot. It happened in front of other people. Tasha invited us to dinner. Just 4 of us. Her fiancé Mark, me, and Ethan. Nothing dramatic. Wine, pasta, soft lighting. The kind of night that looks like adulthood done right. For the first half hour, everything was normal. Ethan told stories. He laughed at the right moments. He asked Mark about work, and I remember thinking, maybe I really did build this up in my head. Maybe the bookstore thing was coincidence. Maybe the parked car was paranoia. Then Tasha asked me about pottery. "How's the class going?" Simple question. I smiled automatically. It's actually been really nice. Before I could say more, Ethan leaned back in his chair and said lightly, "She loves pretending she's in a rom-com." Everyone laughed, including me, because what else do you do? Tasha tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He smiled. "You know, the moody warehouse studio, the mysterious artists. It's her little escape." Escape. That word hit differently. I felt heat rise in my neck. "It's not like that," I said quietly. He shrugged. "I'm joking. Always joking. Always harmless." But something in the air shifted. Because now my hobby wasn't just pottery, it was performance, fantasy, and indulgence. And I watched Tasha recalibrate me slightly in her mind. Not dramatically, just a fraction. And that's how isolation starts, millimeter by millimeter. On the drive home, I said carefully, "Why did you say that?" "Say what?" "That I'm pretending." He exhaled slowly. "You're sensitive lately." Not defensive, not angry, just diagnosing. I was teasing. It didn't feel like teasing. He glanced at me briefly. "You always assume the worst." There it was again, not his behavior, my interpretation, and I felt myself shrink. Because arguing that something hurt you when someone claims it was a joke makes you look fragile. So I stopped. The next escalation happened at the studio. Pam announced we'd be having a small showcase in a few weeks. Nothing fancy, just inviting friends and family to see what we'd made. I hesitated before telling Ethan, not because I didn't want him there, but because I didn't want to feel monitored. Still, I told him. He smiled. Of course I'll come. And when the night arrived, he did, dressed nicely, charming. He shook hands with Pam, complimented her space. He looked proud, which should have made me happy. But instead, I felt watched. Not admired, not supported. Watched. Every time I spoke to someone, I could feel his eyes on me. If I laughed too long, I'd glance up and see him studying my face. If I leaned in to hear someone over the music, I'd feel the weight of his attention. And afterward, in the car, it started. Subtle, measured. That guy seemed very comfortable with you. He's in his 60s. Still, that word. Not accusatory, just suggestive. Planting something. You were glowing tonight, he added softly. That should have felt romantic. Instead, it felt like surveillance footage commentary. A week later, Tasha texted me. Are you okay? My chest tightened. Yeah. Why? Ethan mentioned you've been stressed, that you're overwhelmed, that you're pulling away. I stared at the screen, because I had never said that. I had never framed myself that way. He had. And suddenly I understood something devastating. He wasn't just watching me. He was narrating me. To other people. Creating a version of me that sounded fragile, unstable, overstimulated. So if I ever said, I think he's following me, it would land like this. She's been overwhelmed lately. She's building stories. He told us she's stressed, and that realization was colder than anything else, because now the room wasn't just shrinking internally, it was shrinking socially. That night, I asked him directly, why are you telling people I'm overwhelmed? He looked confused. I'm not. Tasha said, I said you've been stressed. That's not a crime. You made it sound like I'm not myself. He sighed. You're not. Silence. What does that mean? You've been distant, suspicious, defensive. The words hit like quiet darts. You're acting like I'm doing something wrong. I never said that. You don't have to. There it was. The flip. Now I was the one hurting him. Now I was the one creating tension. And suddenly the entire dynamic felt inverted. I wasn't being observed. He was being misunderstood. That's the genius of subtle control. It never looks like control. It looks like concern. After that, I started second-guessing everything. If I felt watched, maybe it was guilt. If I felt monitored, maybe it was insecurity. If he showed up somewhere, maybe it was love. I started explaining him to myself. He just misses you. He just wants closeness. He just doesn't understand boundaries. And that word, boundaries. That's when I realized something chilling. We had never actually defined them, because in our marriage, access had always been assumed. Total transparency, total availability, total presence. And I had mistaken that for intimacy. But my body knew before my brain did. I started clenching my jaw at night, waking up with headaches, feeling tension in my shoulders when I heard his car pull into the driveway. Not fear, just anticipation. Like I needed to prepare for commentary, prepare for observation, prepare to be read. I stopped journaling at home. I'd take my notebook to the car instead, sit in parking lots and write, because I didn't want to feel like someone might walk past the doorway and glance at the page. And that's when it hit me fully. I didn't feel alone in my own house. Not because he was violent, not because he was loud, but because he was present. Always. Watching. Interpreting. Adjusting. The night of the flickering streetlight. The smile. I was nearby. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part wasn't even the following. It was what I discovered later. The detail that made everything click into place. The thing I didn't see until 20 minutes into unraveling my own life. And when I finally understood it, I realized something devastating. He hadn't just been studying me. He'd been rehearsing. The rehearsal. There's a difference between instinct and proof. Instinct whispers. Proof rearranges your life. And the proof didn't come from catching him. It came from something smaller, something stupid, something almost laughable, which is how the worst realizations usually arrive. It started with a charger. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a black phone charger that I kept in my car. I always kept it in the center console, because I forget to plug my phone in overnight. And one afternoon I reached for it, and it wasn't there. Not missing, just moved. In the glove compartment, wrapped neatly, like someone had organized it. I didn't move it, and Ethan didn't use my car, ever. He hated driving it, said the seat position was wrong, said it felt off. So why would he have been in it? I told myself it wasn't important, but something about the neatness bothered me, like someone had been inside and wanted to leave no trace. A few days later, I noticed something else. My mileage. Higher than expected. Not by a lot, just enough. I started calculating. Work commute, groceries, pottery. It didn't add up, so I did something I hadn't done before. I checked the car's internal trip history. Modern cars store recent drives, dates, times, duration, and there they were. Short trips, late at night, after I was asleep. 3 miles, 5 miles, 7 miles, all in the direction of the studio. My hands went cold, because that wasn't coincidence, that wasn't feeling, that wasn't intuition, that was deliberate. I didn't confront him immediately. That's important, because I needed to know if I was ready for the answer. Instead, I watched him. At dinner, on the couch, in bed, he looked the same. Calm, measured, unbothered. And suddenly I saw it. The rehearsal. He hadn't been showing up spontaneously. He'd been driving the route beforehand, learning the timing, calculating how long class lasted, mapping when to arrive so it looked accidental. That's why he was sometimes already there. He wasn't following me. He was staging it. And that realization didn't make me feel hunted. It made me feel engineered. The night I opened this story with the flickering streetlight, the smile, I was nearby. That night was different. Because I knew about the mileage by then. I knew about the late-night drives. And when I walked out of the studio and saw him leaning against my car, I didn't feel confused. I felt certain. He hadn't just arrived. He'd been waiting for the right moment to emerge, waiting for me to look relaxed, waiting for me to forget. And when he saw me, he stepped forward, not rushed, not defensive, smooth, like an actor hitting his mark. I didn't freeze this time. I walked straight toward him. Why were you in my car? His expression didn't change. What? You've been driving it. He tilted his head slightly. Of course I have. It's ours. That word, ours. I saw the trip history. A pause, just a flicker, then composure again. I moved it once. You parked too close to the curb. 3 times? Another pause. You're keeping track of mileage now? There it was. The shift. Not denial. Redirection. You're proving my point. What point? That you're spiraling. Spiraling. The word hit harder than if he'd yelled. Because spiraling implies instability, implies imagination, implies overreaction. You drove toward the studio. Silence. Then a slow inhale. I wanted to see if you were safe. Safe. Always safe. I was inside. You don't know who's around. That was the first time his tone sharpened. Just slightly. Why didn't you just ask? I didn't want to make you feel watched. The irony. The quiet, sick irony. I held his gaze. Were you waiting for me tonight? He didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer instead. Lowered his voice. I like knowing where my wife is. That wasn't an apology. It wasn't denial. It was a philosophy. And suddenly, everything aligned. The bookstore, the parked SUV, the studio doorway, the feeling, the calm, the narration to friends. It wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about infidelity. It wasn't about suspicion. It was about control through omnipresence. If he was everywhere, I would never feel fully separate. And if I never felt separate, I would never feel powerful enough to leave. It wasn't the following that scared me. It was the logic. He believed he was justified. He believed closeness meant access. He believed marriage meant surveillance. And because he never screamed, because he never hit, because he never threatened, he believed he was the reasonable one, which meant he would never see a problem, which meant it would never stop. That night, when we got home, I locked myself in the bathroom. Not because I was afraid he'd break the door down, but because I needed a door between us, a physical boundary. I sat on the edge of the tub, and for the first time in my marriage, I felt unsafe in a way I couldn't explain to anyone else. Not unsafe like violence. Unsafe like erosion. Like my autonomy was dissolving molecule by molecule. And the worst part? He was in the kitchen, making tea. Calm. Like nothing had happened. Here's the truth that took me the longest to admit. He didn't want to hurt me. He wanted to own the version of me that existed outside him. He wanted to reduce randomness, eliminate unpredictability. He wanted my world to orbit him, not through force, through presence. And presence, when constant enough, becomes pressure. The breaking point didn't happen that night. It happened 2 weeks later, at 10:42 p.m. in that same parking lot, under that same flickering light. When he said something he didn't mean to say, something small, something careless, and that's when I finally knew. He hadn't just been nearby. He'd been watching long before I ever noticed. The slip. The breaking point wasn't cinematic. No shattered glass, no neighbors listening through walls, no dramatic ultimatum. It was a sentence. One careless sentence. 2 weeks after the confrontation about the mileage. 2 weeks of artificial calm. He had backed off, at least visibly. No more appearances, no comments about timing, no subtle corrections of my memory. If anything, he seemed lighter, like he'd decided to give me space. And I almost relaxed. That was my mistake. It was 10:42 p.m. I remember because I looked at my phone. Class had run late. Pam's kiln had finally been repaired and everyone stayed longer, celebrating like it was some kind of victory. I walked out of the studio alone. The air was cooler than usual. That same flickering streetlight hummed above the parking lot. And for a split second, I thought maybe tonight would be quiet. Then I saw him, leaning against my car again, but not smiling this time. Just watching the door, waiting. I walked up slowly. Didn't rush, didn't react. "Why are you here?" He exhaled. "I told you. I like knowing when you're done." My jaw tightened. "I didn't text you." "I know." That word landed heavy. "I just knew." Silence stretched between us. Then he said it, casual, offhand. "Pam usually locks up at 10:30, but when the kiln's running, she stays until 10:45. My body went cold. "How do you know that?" A pause. Small, but real. "I've been around. Around. Not driving by, not coincidentally passing. Around." "How long?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. "You make it sound sinister." "How long?" Another pause. "Since the third class." The third class. My mind replayed every evening, every time I thought I was alone, every time I laughed freely, every time I felt separate. He'd been there. Sometimes in the parking lot, sometimes down the block, sometimes just driving past. Not because he thought I was cheating, not because he suspected anything specific, because he didn't like not knowing. "Why?" I asked quietly, and this time he didn't deflect. He didn't say safe, he didn't say feeling. He said, "You change when you're here." The words didn't come out angry. They came out factual. "What does that mean?" "You're different. Lighter. Less aware of me. Less aware of me." There it was. The core. It wasn't about protection. It wasn't about suspicion. It was about losing proximity. "You disappear," he added. And for a second, I almost laughed. Because that's the irony. The entire time I'd been feeling like I was disappearing inside the marriage. He'd been terrified of disappearing from me. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to name before. Fear. Not fear of me leaving. Fear of not being central. Fear of not being the axis. And instead of processing that fear, He'd tried to control the radius. You don't own the version of me that exists without you, I said. He flinched slightly. I'm your husband. Yes. And it means partnership, not surveillance. The word landed between us, finally spoken. He didn't deny it. He just looked confused, like I'd redefined something without his permission. There was no explosion, no screaming, just a stillness. I can't do this, I said. He blinked. Do what? Live like I'm being monitored. You're exaggerating. No, I replied. I'm done negotiating my sanity. And that was it. The line. Not dramatic, not loud, just final. The leaving. I didn't pack that night. I didn't storm out. I slept in the guest room, for the first time in years, and I realized something startling. Silence felt different, not heavy, not tense, just empty. The next morning I called Tasha, not to vent, not to accuse, just to say, I think I'm leaving. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't say I was overreacting. She just said, do you feel like yourself? And that question broke something open, because the answer was simple. No. We separated quietly. No public scandal, no dramatic social media post, just paperwork, logistics, boxes. He tried to frame it as misunderstanding, as incompatibility, as stress. And maybe, on paper, that's what it was. But here's what I know now. Love without boundaries becomes control. Control without violence still damages. And being known isn't the same as being watched. What I understand now, for a long time, I thought the most dangerous marriages were loud, the ones with shouting, with broken dishes, with police reports. But sometimes the most disorienting ones are quiet, where nothing is technically wrong, where no one else sees the problem, where you look ungrateful for leaving. I didn't leave because he hit me. I didn't leave because he cheated. I left because I couldn't breathe inside constant presence. I left because I was nearby, stopped feeling romantic, and started feeling like a cage without bars. He wasn't evil. He wasn't a villain in a thriller. He was a man who couldn't tolerate unpredictability, and I was a woman who needed air. And when those two things collided, someone was always going to shrink. For years, it was me, until it wasn't. I used to think love meant being deeply known. Now I understand. Love also means being allowed to exist when no one is watching. If something in this story felt familiar, if at any point you caught yourself thinking, I've felt that, but I never had the words for it, then you understand why this channel exists. This is where we talk about what stayed hidden, the parts no one sees, the marriages that looked fine on the outside, but were quietly unraveling underneath. If you believe some stories need to be told, not to attack, not to dramatize, but to bring clarity, then follow this channel. There are more stories that were whispered, more truths that were minimized, more moments that changed everything. And if you know someone who needs to hear that they're not alone, share this. Sometimes freedom begins the moment we finally hear what was hidden all along.